few amenities that we get today in the military as a result of this movement as advocacy at that time. It was a movement that helped to bring about a massive amount of change, particularly as it deals with the limited rights that military members have now. These guys back then were literally breaking the law. I mean, there was no law to protect what they're doing. I have limited rights to protect what I'm doing today. It was in 1969 that 1,365 of these active duty members published an open appeal in the New York Times calling for an end to the war, but also for there to be no reprisals against active duty members who participated in the big moratorium march in D.C. at that time, November 15th of 1969. It was a movement that then after that, 1,700 more did another big petition. It was a movement that by 1971, Colonel Robert Hale, a colonel within the United States Army, wrote a report called The Collapse of the United States Armed Forces, in which he was giving it to a senatorial committee, the Armed Services Committee, in which he was documenting what was taking place in the armed services at that time. Some of you have probably seen the picture of those GIs in Vietnam. Actually, I don't celebrate it, but it was happening, just to tell you how much the disenchantment was actually, smoking out of the barrel of a gun, and pretty much doing it defiantly to their commanders. But by 1971, they described the Army as being drug-ridden, as being in despair, as being totally broken, as being mutinous, at a point where actual officers were afraid to lead, afraid for their lives. In 1969, 126 of them had gotten fragged by the enlisted men. It rose to about 500 in 1970. By 1971, almost 1,000 officers getting fragged. Frag means killed. Okay, it actually means that these enlisted men are so disenchanted, they don't want to go into battle. And if you're the gun-ho officer, saying we're going to battle, these officers at this point, they were afraid for their lives, a good number of them. It was the history of a black GI named Billy Smith, okay, who actually was on trial for his life, and it was an international movement that mobilized and saved his life. On trial for his life was supposedly fragging an officer. It was a movement, and this church put racism on the front line of the struggle. It was a movement that fought against racism. It was a movement of black GIs coming home from Vietnam and now refusing to be used as riot control against urban rebellions in places like Detroit, in places like Chicago, places like Newark. Okay, it's the movement of actual racial rebellions taking place on those carriers like the Kitty Hawk and the USS Constellation. Okay, where black GIs with their allies fighting for improved conditions, and we know the Navy's history of racism was quite sickening in comparison to the other services. It was the history of actual movements to stop carriers from actually going out to sea, the USS Constellation. It was actual civilians with those activists within the armed services actually started a petition drive, actually a mock vote, if you will, to stop the USS Constellation. And the name of that movement was the SOS movement, Stop Our Ship movement. Okay, this was a glorious movement. It was a movement about rebellion within the stockades. Okay, some of you may have heard of the Presidio 27. Okay, these were the young men who, the famous picture of them joining hands and having to sit down in front of the stockade. The ASU, okay, this is the American Service Members Union. For the first time in the history of this country, members of the armed forces saying, we're workers too. We're a part of the working class as well, and we deserve a union, we deserve protection. And it's in that sense, yes, you clap for that. It is in that sense where the appeal for redress ultimately would like to see itself go. To be able, because we're workers too. We all workers. We all get up and have to give our labor, to the powers that be every day. And in return, can we get some limited rights? Can we at least meet? Can we at least have some discussion about the things that we're compelled to deal with on a day-to-day basis? The ASU was really monumental. It's interesting I bring that up because I had a chance to talk with Terry Klug and Andy Stapp and those guys. But what I like about the ASU is that it looked at organization. It looked at, this started out in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And in fact, this might be a good segue into a clip that I want to show real quickly. If we can dim the lights real quick. It's about a 5-6 minute clip on the Sir No Sir DVD. It's an outtake. It's a good time to show it. It deals with the ASU because I see them really as a model for what this movement could be. So why don't I segue into that real quickly, and then I'll go ahead and wrap it up, and we'll go ahead and take some questions and comments. So let me do that real quickly. Thank you all for being so attentive, I tell you. want to go to the, oh, here we go. All right, American Servicemen, here you go.
Thank God we were young then and didn't think. You know, it's very important to be impulsive, don't think. And in college, I was opposed to the war, but I got a sense of frustration that I thought maybe if I went in the Army, I could agitate against the war and directly to the people that were being forced to go fight it. But I burned my draft card in October '65. They were all across the country. There were demonstrations where people burned their draft card. So I couldn't get in. I tried to volunteer. I tried the Marine Corps. I tried the Air Force. I think I tried all of them. Finally, I went back to the Army. I tried a different recruiter. And I said, I don't have a draft card, but I'm volunteering for the draft. And he didn't ask me why I didn't have a draft card. I went in, and of course I was immediately sorry. Immediately sorry. Then they put us all on a train to Fort Jackson. I remember looking across the platform. One of the guys that had just been sworn in was on the train north to New York. He had deserted. Well, geez, I mean, you could have just been this trap. Now you're a deserter. Being in the Army, beginning to realize it wasn't just being against the war, it was also, there's this officer corps, and then there's the great body of enlisted troops, and there's a big contradiction between the two. And soldiers don't just need, you know, to be against the war. They actually need a union that could protect them and mobilize them and so on. Anyway, we formed the American Servicemen Union. This was in 1968. And between 1968 and 1973, there were about 20,000 soldiers in and out of the American Servicemen Union. We used to get copies of the Bond, which was the ASU newspaper, and we could see the date on the newspaper. That newspaper had been circulating and circulating among soldiers. It was read to pieces. You could tell it had just been read to pieces. And the Bond meant the bond between civilian anti-war people and soldiers in the Army who were anti-war. And that's how the Bond circulated. Civilians in Chicago would hand it to soldiers going to the Great Lakes Naval Base. This was pretty simple to do. We would have hundreds of bonds and just hand them out. And they would flood into the base.
They took me to Fort Dix. It's a stockade there, which was a large stockade. Fort Dix military base was a large base. But they had a sign over it, and it said, remember Danny, it said, obedience to the law is freedom. And I always used to think it was so ironic to have that. Obedience to the law is freedom. And I thought, no, it's not. You know, what are you talking about? There was this other guy coming in with me at the same time. I don't know where they brought him.